The candles in the Solen Hall burned gold for everyone else. For Caliph, they burned a shade lower. Not dramatically. Not in a way anyone would notice or report to the court historian. Just less. The way light behaves around something it has already forgotten. He stood in his designated position at the far left of the royal dais, third step from the bottom, which was not technically a dais position at all. It was the architectural equivalent of a footnote. The court architects had not designed it for a prince. They had designed it for a ceremonial attendant, someone who held things, announced things, disappeared between functions. But 3 seasons ago, after the rite of succession had concluded and Caliph had walked out of the sanctum without his magic and without a word of explanation from anyone in power, the chamberlain had simply stopped placing his marker on the upper steps. No one had told him to move down. No one had told him anything. The marker appeared on the third step from the bottom, and Caliph had walked to it and stood on it and kept his spine straight, because that was the only thing in this court he still owned completely. His spine. His silence. The particular quality of his stillness that made Lesser Fae nervous without understanding why. Below the dais, the hall moved in the choreography of a high court gathering. Lords and ladies in their seasonal colors, diplomatic envoys from the border clans pretending not to assess each other's jewelry, the younger courtiers practicing the art of being seen without appearing to try. Caliph watched all of it with the expression he had perfected over the last 3 seasons. Present. Attentive. Entirely unreachable. He had once been the reason they all looked up. He remembered that. He was not sentimental about it. Sentiment required a softness he had surgically removed sometime around the 4th week after the rite, when he had finally accepted that the magic was not returning on its own, and that no one was coming to investigate why a Fae prince had been hollowed out during a succession ceremony that was supposed to be ceremonial. He remembered what it felt like to walk into a room and have the air change. The way his power had moved through him like water through river rock. Not something he summoned, just something he was. The flowers. Gods, the flowers. He had never asked for that. Blooms following his footsteps like embarrassing punctuation. He had found it excessive. He missed it the way you miss a sound you didn't know you were hearing until the room went completely quiet. The room now was completely quiet. For him. "You're doing it again," said a voice beside him, low enough that only he could hear it. Caliph did not look. "Doing what?" "The thing where you look at the room like you're memorizing it for a portrait you'll paint later. In their blood. That's dramatic. You have a very specific expression, see?" The speaker was Lyra, not her full court name, which was 3 syllables longer and required a specific tonal inflection he had never bothered to master. She was his one remaining attendant. Not because the court had officially reduced his staff, but because everyone else had gradually accepted reassignments, and Lyra had not, and no one had thought to assign her away from him specifically because acknowledging it would require acknowledging that he existed in a way that warranted management. She was standing 3 inches behind his left shoulder. Exactly where she was supposed to be. She had never once stood in a position that would draw more attention to either of them. "The envoy from the Greyvale delegation keeps looking at you," she said. "The Greyvale delegation is here to renegotiate the Eastern water rights. They're looking at everyone of rank to assess leverage. You're not of rank anymore. Technically." "No," Caliph agreed. "Technically." A pause. "He keeps looking anyway," Lyra said. Caliph did not respond to that. He had stopped responding to observations that had no actionable conclusion. It was a discipline he had built slowly, the way you build anything without magic. Manually, painfully, one decision at a time. At the top of the dais, his brother held court. Uldren. Crown Prince Uldren, now, though the coronation had not yet been formally scheduled. There were rituals to complete, astronomers to consult, a specific configuration of moons that the high clerics required before they would sanction the transfer of the royal seal. Uldren had been navigating these bureaucratic delays with visible patience and invisible fury, which was the closest he ever came to having a personality. He was everything the court needed in an heir. Broad-shouldered, clear-eyed, possessed of a magic so densely structured it registered in the room as a kind of pressure. Not uncomfortable, just present, like weather. He made decisions quickly. He smiled at the right moments. He had married a politically useful consort 3 years ago, and produced an heir 8 months later with an efficiency the court had applauded with genuine warmth. He was also the only person alive who knew exactly what had happened inside the right of succession sanctum. Caliph knew this because Uldren had told him. Not in confession, not in cruelty. In the flat, explanatory tone of someone settling an administrative matter. I needed it more than you did. You would have been wasted on the throne. You're too particular. And then he had straightened his ceremonial collar and walked out, and the doors had sealed behind him, and Caliph had been alone in a sanctum that smelled of burnt magic and something that used to be his. Too particular. He had turned the phrase over for 3 seasons the way you turn a stone to find what lives underneath it. He still wasn't sure if it was an insult or the most honest thing his brother had ever said to him. On the dais, Uldren's gaze moved across the hall in a slow, practiced arc, taking inventory, as he always did, of who was present and what they represented. The arc reached the 3rd step from the bottom. It did not stop. It moved on, fluid and unhurried, the way your eyes move across furniture. Caliph breathed in through his nose, out through his mouth. His hands remained still at his sides. His spine remained straight. The candles around him continued their slightly lesser burning, and the hall continued its choreography, and no one looked at the 3rd step from the bottom except the Greyvale envoy, who would stop looking soon enough when he understood that there was nothing there worth negotiating with. He didn't even pause, Lyra said, very quietly. No, Caliph said. I'm sorry. Don't. He said it without sharpness. Without anything, really. It doesn't require a response. She was quiet for a moment. Then, what does it require? He considered this genuinely. It was the kind of question Lyra asked that he had never been able to dismiss, not because she was particularly wise, but because she asked them in the specific tone of someone who actually wanted to know. Endurance, he said finally. That's all it's ever required. The hall doors at the far end opened to admit the next delegation. Caliph did not look up immediately. He was still looking at the space where his brother's gaze had passed over him, that smooth, uninterrupted arc, cataloging it the way he cataloged everything now. Not for a portrait, not in anyone's blood, just filing it, because he had learned, in 3 seasons on the 3rd step from the bottom, that everything was information if you were disciplined enough to receive it without flinching. He looked up when the temperature changed. Not dramatically, not in a way the hall immediately registered, but something shifted in the quality of the air near the far doors. A drop, slight and sourceless, like stepping from a corridor into a room where a window has been left open onto something very old. And then the scent reached him. Ancient rain, cold iron. Something underneath both of those that had no name because it had existed before the language that would have named it. Caliph's dead magic moved. Once, a single pulse, deep in his chest, like a word spoken in a room you thought was empty. He went very still. On the 3rd step from the bottom, in the hall where the candles burned slightly less for him, Caliph stood with his spine straight and his hands still and felt something in his hollowed-out core respond to a presence that had not yet fully entered the room. He did not know what it was. He would spend a long time later wishing he had run. The delegation from the far doors did not announce itself. That alone was enough to make the hall notice. Every formal entry into the Solen Hall followed the same architecture. The doors opened, the chamberlain stepped forward. The name and title of the arriving party was spoken into the room with the precise intonation that indicated their rank and the degree of attention the court was expected to perform. It was a system so embedded in Fey court function that Caliph had stopped consciously registering it years ago, the way you stop hearing a clock after enough time in the same room. The clock had stopped. The chamberlain stood at the far doors with his mouth slightly open, and his announcement scroll held at an angle that suggested his hands had made a decision his mind had not yet ratified. The doors were open. The entry space was not empty, exactly. It was the wrong word. The space was occupied in a way that had nothing to do with a body standing in it. The temperature had dropped another degree. Around Caliph, the hall was recalibrating. He could see it happening in real time, the subtle shift in posture, the conversations that tapered without conclusion, the way 3 separate lords turned toward the far doors with the specific expression of people who wanted to assess a threat without appearing to assess a threat. The Greyvale envoy, who had been watching Caliph for the better part of an hour, had stopped watching Caliph entirely. The scent had reached the center of the hall now. Ancient rain, cold iron, that third thing underneath. Caliph's dead magic pulsed again. Twice this time, irregular, like a second heartbeat that had forgotten its rhythm. He pressed his fingers flat against his thigh and said nothing and kept his face in the expression he had perfected. The one that was present and attentive and entirely unreachable. Whatever had entered the hall had not yet fully entered the hall. And then it did. He was tall in the way that certain things are tall, not measurable exactly, or rather, the measurement felt beside the point. He wore nothing that indicated rank or origin. Dark clothing, simply cut, the kind of garment that would have looked unremarkable on anyone else and looked on him like a deliberate choice to not be looked at directly, which was having the opposite effect. His face. Caliph had braced for it somehow and still was not prepared. It was almost too symmetrical. Not beautiful in the face sense, which tended toward the luminous, toward things that glowed and shifted and invited. Beautiful in an older sense. The way certain ruins are beautiful. The way something is beautiful when it has survived long enough to become the only remaining example of what it was. He did not look at the court. He looked, assessed, the room in a single slow movement, the way you check a space you have entered many times before and are confirming has not changed significantly since your last visit. His gaze moved across the dais. It stopped. Third step from the bottom. Caliph held absolutely still. The contact lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Perhaps less. It did not feel like less. It felt like the specific duration of something that had already been decided before it began. Not a question, not an assessment. A confirmation. The fallen god's eyes registered him with the particular quality of attention you give to something you have already been watching from a greater distance for a very long time. Then the gaze moved on. The hall exhaled without knowing it had been holding its breath. Beside Caliph, Lyra made a very small sound that was not quite a word. "Don't," Caliph said quietly. "I wasn't going to say anything. Your breathing said it for you." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you know what that is?" No. This was not entirely true. He knew what the old texts called it, the space between texts, the name written in margins and then crossed out, the reference that other references referred to without ever completing. He knew what the temple clerics whispered when they thought the younger priests could not hear them. He knew what his mother had told him once, when he was very young and had asked why the oldest sanctuary in the Fey Court had its central mosaic covered with a cloth that no one was permitted to lift. Because some things, she had said, are not forgotten. They are simply set down. And if you look at them directly, they remember you looked. He knew what it was. He was not going to say it in the Solen Hall on a night when he was already standing on the third step from the bottom with his brother's gaze moving across him like furniture. The formal proceedings began 20 minutes later, which was long enough for the hall to collectively decide that the presence near the far doors was either an invited guest of extraordinary and unannounced rank or a problem that would be someone else's responsibility to address. The court had a remarkable facility for this kind of decision. It was one of the things Caliph had come to appreciate about Fey politics in his reduced capacity, watching how quickly a room full of powerful people could choose, in unison and without discussion, not to see something. He was something of an expert on that particular phenomenon. The Greyvale water rights negotiation proceeded. 2 minor territorial acknowledgements were formalized. A betrothal between a border clan's eldest daughter and a cousin of the royal line was announced with the appropriate degree of celebration, which was moderate, because the cousin in question was the kind of cousin courts produced when they ran out of better options. Caliph stood on the third step and listened and filed everything away and did not look toward the far doors again. He was not going to look toward the far doors again. He looked toward the far doors again, once, quickly, and the being was still there, not standing exactly as he had been, but present in the same space in a way that suggested he had not moved so much as redistributed, like smoke that has shifted without a wind source. He was not watching the proceedings. He was not watching anything in particular. Except that Caliph had the sudden and entirely unreasonable conviction that this was not true. He returned his gaze to the proceedings. His dead magic pulsed, steady this time, like something that had found a rhythm it intended to keep. It was Uldren who ended it. The formal proceedings had concluded and the hall had shifted into the looser register of a post-ceremony gathering. The music had started, quiet and structural. The kind of composition designed to facilitate conversation rather than interrupt it. Caliph had been calculating the earliest appropriate moment to withdraw. There was a window of approximately 12 minutes between the end of formal proceedings and the point at which an early withdrawal would be noted and catalogued as an irregularity. He intended to use every one of those 12 minutes and then leave with the precision of someone who had somewhere to be. He was on minute 9 when Uldren crossed the hall toward him. This was unusual. Uldren did not cross halls to speak to him. Uldren spoke to him when proximity made it unavoidable. Adjacent seats at a state dinner, the narrow corridor outside the Sanctum Records room, moments where the architecture of the court forced an acknowledgement. He did not cross rooms. Crossing rooms was intentional. Crossing rooms meant he wanted something or wanted something witnessed. Caliph watched him approach and kept his expression exactly where it was. Uldren stopped 2 steps below him, which put them at approximately the same eye level, which Caliph understood was calculated. His brother was good at calculations. It was possibly the only thing they had in common anymore. "You look well," Uldren said. His voice was pleasant. It was always pleasant. That was one of the things that made him good at his position. "Thank you," Caliph said. "I wanted to discuss the Eastern Sanctum assignment." Caliph waited. "The clerics have requested a representative of the royal line to perform the seasonal boundary rite next week. The outer temple. The vet his one." A brief pause calibrated. "I thought of you immediately. The outer temple. The vet his sanctuary. 3 hours from the court by the old roads, through terrain that the border patrols had officially classified as low priority, which was the bureaucratic language for we do not go there if we can avoid it. A seasonal boundary rite performed by a royal representative with no magic, in a temple associated with forgotten worship, alone. The hall was not watching. Or it was watching the way it had learned to watch Caliph, with the peripheral attention of people who had decided they were not looking at something. "The vet his temple," Caliph said. His voice was even. "The one the clerics haven't staffed in 4 years. The boundary rites don't require staff. They require lineage." Uldren's expression was helpful, patient, the expression of someone explaining something straightforward. "You have that, still. Whatever else, you have that. Whatever else." The phrase sat in the air between them. Caliph looked at his brother, really looked the way he rarely permitted himself to do in public because it cost something he had learned to ration carefully. He saw the calculation underneath the pleasantness, the clean, administrative quality of it. Uldren was not cruel in the way that required passion. He was cruel in the way that required efficiency. Send the magicless prince to the forgotten temple. The rite would fail, it required active power to complete. The failure would be documented. The documentation would be used. A prince who could not perform the most basic court function. A footnote that was becoming a liability. Caliph breathed in. "I'll go," he said. Uldren blinked. It was the smallest possible tell, a quarter-second recalibration. He had expected negotiation or deflection, or the kind of quiet dignity that could be reframed as obstruction. He had not expected immediate agreement. "The rite requires full ceremonial preparation." "I know the preparation. I was performing boundary rites before you knew what they were for." Caliph held his brother's gaze with the particular quality of stillness that made Lesser Fae nervous. "I'll go. Next week. I'll represent the royal line. I'll perform the rite." He smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who has just accepted a condition of their own survival on their own terms, which is a different thing entirely from losing. "Was there anything else?" Caliph asked. Uldren looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he nodded once, turned, and walked back across the hall with his posture perfect, and his calculations already reorganizing themselves around an outcome he hadn't planned for. The hall had not been watching. The hall had seen everything. In the space near the far doors, in the slightly lesser light, something that had existed before the language that would name it watched the third step from the bottom with the patient, ancient attention of something that has been waiting a very long time and has just confirmed it is waiting in the right place. Caliph did not look. His dead magic beat in his chest like a second heart that had decided, without his permission, to keep time. "Before we go further, if this story already has you, this is the moment. Like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens at the Vethis Temple. You're going to want to be there for that. The road to the Vethis Temple was not on any current court map. This was not an oversight. The cartographers who had produced the last official survey of the Eastern Territories had simply stopped at a certain point and drawn the border of the known world at the edge of a tree line that everyone understood marked the beginning of somewhere else. No notation, no explanation, just the clean edge of the map and, beyond it, white space that the court had collectively agreed to treat as absence rather than unknown. Caliph had found the older maps in the Sanctum Archive 3 seasons ago, in the weeks after the rite when he had needed somewhere to be that was not his chamber and not the court and not any of the spaces that had reorganized themselves around his reduced presence. The archive had not reorganized. It did not care about succession rights or magic or the political geometry of who stood where on the dais. Cared about preservation. It was the one room in the court that treated everything with exactly equal indifference, and he had found that restful in a way he had not been able to explain to Lyra when she asked where he was spending his afternoons. The older maps showed the road. It ran northeast from the court's outer wall, through the managed forest that the border clans used for seasonal grazing, and then past the tree line that the current cartographers had made their border, and continued for another hour through terrain that the old notations described with words like threshold and between and, in one case, a symbol Caliph had not been able to identify in any of the linguistic references he had access to. A symbol that looked, at certain angles, like a door drawn by someone who had only ever heard a door described. He traveled alone. He had told Lyra he would be back before the week was out and had not told her where he was going specifically, because Lyra would have found a way to come with him and he did not want her in the between space, whatever it was. She would have argued. He had left before she woke. The court horse he had been assigned, a practical gray, nothing ceremonial, another small notation in the ongoing documentation of his reduced status, picked its way along the old road with the specific reluctance of an animal that was following its training against its better judgment. Caliph let it set the pace. He had time. He had nothing but time, in the particular way of people who have been removed from all the systems that used to structure their days and have rebuilt their hours around something quieter and harder to name. The forest changed past the tree line. Not dramatically. He had expected dramatic. The old texts tended toward the dramatic when they described threshold spaces, all sudden silences and lights at wrong angles and the feeling of being watched by things with too many eyes. The reality was subtler and, because of that, more unsettling. The trees were the same species. The light was the same quality. The birdsong continued, unchanged, for approximately 10 minutes past the cartographer's border, and then it did not stop so much as become optional. Present when he focused on it, absent when he didn't, as though sound in this place had decided to become a courtesy rather than a constant. The temperature dropped 2 degrees. Then 2 more. The horse stopped walking and Caliph did not push it. He dismounted, tied the reins to a branch with a knot that was more symbolic than practical. If the horse decided to leave, it would leave, and continued on foot along a road that was becoming less a road and more a suggestion that the ground had once been used this way and remembered it. The Vethis Temple emerged from the tree line the way certain things emerge, not by becoming visible but by becoming impossible to continue not seeing. One moment there was forest. Then there was a structure of pale stone that had been there long enough to have opinions about the forest growing around it rather than the reverse. Caliph stood at the entrance and looked at it for a long moment. It was smaller than the court sanctums. Lower. The architectural language was different, older, less interested in height as a metaphor for authority, more interested in the ground it was built on, the way the stone had been set directly into the earth without a raised foundation, as though whoever built it had wanted the building to be a continuation of the ground rather than a statement above it. The entrance was an arch without a door. The interior was dark in the way that spaces are dark when they have been closed to light for long enough that the darkness has settled into texture. He could feel it from here. Not magic, not his magic, which remained absent in the specific way of an empty room, present as a shape but without content. Something older than what he would have called magic if asked to define the term. A pressure, low and structural, the kind you feel in deep water or in the moment before a storm when the air has already made its decision and the thunder is simply the announcement. The seasonal rite required entry. Caliph entered. The interior was a single chamber. The floor was the same pale stone as the exterior, worn smooth in patterns that were not random, pathways of use, decades or centuries of feet moving between specific points, the architecture of ritual made visible in erosion. In the center of the chamber, a shallow basin had been cut directly into the floor, perhaps 2 feet across, filled now with nothing. Dry. The kind of dry that takes a long time. Along the walls at eye level, the mosaic. He had known it would be here. The older maps had noted it, central chamber, walls intact, mosaic in preservation. What the maps had not noted, or had not been able to note, was what the mosaic depicted. From the entrance it was difficult to read. The tesserae were small, the colors deep, the arrangement not immediately narrative. He moved closer, along the worn pathway the floor remembered, until he was close enough to see. It was a figure. Large. The scale of the mosaic made the figure perhaps 8 feet tall relative to the chamber it occupied. Not realistic scale, devotional scale, the scale of something rendered larger than its surroundings to indicate importance rather than dimension. The figure was dark. Deep blues and blacks and a color that was neither, set in a field of what might have been sky or might have been void depending on the light. The face was partially incomplete, not damaged, deliberately unfinished, as though whoever had made it had understood that the face was the part they did not have authority to define. Around the figure's hands, in the mosaic, small shapes that might have been petals or might have been ash, depending. At the base of the figure, in script so old that Caliph could read perhaps one word in 3, he who was set down, he who was not ended, he who. The third line was the one that had been covered with cloth in the court sanctuary. Here it was intact. He who remembers everyone who has ever looked. Caliph straightened slowly. He turned from the mosaic and faced the basin and thought, with the flat practicality that had become his primary mode of survival, about what he was doing here. The rite required a blood offering into the basin, a spoken dedication in Old Fae, and the channeling of royal lineage magic to reseal whatever the boundary rite was meant to reseal. He had the blood. He had memorized the dedication from the archive texts. He did not have the magic. The rite would fail. He had known it would fail when he agreed to come. He had agreed anyway because the alternative was allowing Uldren to see him refuse, to watch him calculate the odds and decline and confirm, in the court's peripheral vision, that the magicless prince could not be trusted with even the reduced ceremonial functions he had been assigned. Failure here would be documented. But refusal would have been worse. Refusal would have been visible in a different way. He was very tired of the calculations. He made them anyway. He knelt at the basin, drew the ceremonial blade, small, silver-handled, the one court object no one had thought to reassign away from him because it was technically a tool rather than an honor, and pressed the edge to his palm with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this enough times that the flinch had been trained out of it. The blood came. He held his hand over the basin and let it fall and spoke the dedication in Old Fae, the words feeling strange in his mouth not because they were unfamiliar but because they were meant to connect to something and he could feel, with horrible precision, the point where the connection was supposed to occur and did not. The basin remained dry around the drops of his blood. The rite did not respond. He finished the dedication anyway, every word, because he had started it and he was going to finish it, and because there was a difference between a thing failing and a thing being abandoned. The last word left his mouth and the chamber was silent. Then the temperature dropped. Not 2 degrees. Not 4. A drop so sudden and complete that Caliph saw his breath in the air before his mind registered that the air had changed. The pale stone of the chamber floor went from cool to cold in the span of a second, the kind of cold that moves upward through the knees, through the hands, that makes the body understand it is in the presence of something that operates outside the agreements that temperature normally keeps. The scent arrived before he heard anything. Ancient rain. Cold iron. And beneath both, that third thing, the one with no name, the one that existed before the language that would have named it. His dead magic did not pulse. It surged. One single surge, from somewhere so deep in his chest he hadn't known it went that far, like something striking a door from the other side. Not breaking through, not trying to. Just confirming the door was there. Caliph rose from his knees. He did not rush. He had made a decision, somewhere in the cold between arriving at the temple and finishing the dedication, that whatever was in this chamber with him was not going to see him scramble. If it was going to see him at all, it was going to see him standing. He turned. The Enigma stood at the entrance to the chamber. He had not been there when Caliph entered. There had been no sound of approach, no footsteps on the worn stone floor, no shift in the air that would have registered as entry. He was simply present now in the way that certain things are present, completely without apology, without the social performance of arrival that living creatures use to announce themselves as non-threatening. He was looking at the mosaic. Not at Caliph. At the mosaic, at the unfinished face in the deep blues and blacks and that other color, at the old script at the base that Caliph could read one word in 3. He looked at it with an expression that had no name in the fey emotional vocabulary Caliph had been raised on. Not grief exactly. Not recognition exactly. Something that contained both and was quieter than either. After a long moment he spoke. His voice was low. It registered in the chest before the ears, the frequency of something that had been speaking long enough that sound had learned to accommodate it rather than the reverse. "You finished the rite," he said. He was still looking at the mosaic. "It didn't take," Caliph said. "No." A pause. "It wasn't going to. I know. You came anyway. I said I would." The Enigma turned from the mosaic then and looked at him fully the way he had in the Solen Hall, with that quality of attention that was not assessment and not threat and not anything Caliph had a clean word for. The chamber was very cold. The candles that had been placed along the walls for the rite had gone out at some point. He wasn't sure when, and the only light now was the diffuse gray of late afternoon coming through the entrance arch, and within that light the fallen god looked exactly like what he was. Something that had been set down. Something that had not been ended. Something that remembered everyone who had ever looked. Caliph did not look away. He was not going to look away. He had made that decision too at some point without announcing it. The Enigma crossed the chamber. Not quickly. Not slowly. With the movement of something that understands it will arrive and so does not need to perform the urgency of arriving. He stopped 3 feet from Caliph, close enough that the cold coming off him was a physical presence. Close enough that the scent was no longer something that crossed a room but something that simply was, the way air is, the way temperature is. He looked down at Caliph's hand. The cut palm, still bleeding slightly, the blood that had fallen into a basin and found nothing to connect to. Something moved through his expression. That nameless thing again. Quieter than grief. Older than recognition. "Your magic is gone," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." "How long?" 3 seasons. "Who?" 1 word. The question Caliph had never been asked directly. Not once. In 3 seasons of court life reorganizing itself around his absence. The court had its theories and its whispers and its careful diplomatic silences. No one had looked at him and asked who. He looked at the fallen god in the gray light of the forgotten temple and felt, absurdly, the specific sensation of being seen by something that could not be lied to. Not because it would catch the lie, but because the lie would be pointless in the way that lying to a mountain is pointless. The mountain is not keeping score. The mountain simply remains. "My brother," Caliph said. The Enigma was quiet for a moment. Then he reached out, slowly, with the deliberateness of something that has learned to move slowly around things it does not want to frighten, and took Caliph's injured hand in both of his. His hands were cold. They were also, paradoxically, the warmest thing Caliph had felt in 3 seasons. He did not examine this. He filed it in the category of things that had no actionable conclusion. The Enigma looked at the cut on his palm. His dead magic, in the deep place it lived, went absolutely still, like something listening. "You should not have been able to perform that rite at all," the Enigma said quietly. "Not without power. I know. You did it anyway. I said I would." The fallen god looked up from his hand, met his eyes. That quality of attention again, confirming, not questioning. Something that had already been decided before this moment, that this moment was simply the arrival of. "Caliph," he said. His name, spoken in a frequency older than Fey language. Spoken like something that had been held for a long time and was being set down carefully, here in this specific place because it had finally found where it belonged. Caliph's breath left him. Just once. Just a single, involuntary exhale, the body making a decision the mind had not authorized. The candles along the wall reignited. All of them, together, burning gold. Not the slightly lesser gold of the Solen Hall. Not the gold that had forgotten him. Full. Complete. The gold of something that had just remembered. The basin in the center of the floor filled with water. The rite completed itself. He remembered very little of what came after. He remembered the cold that became warmth. He remembered a voice speaking in a frequency that bypassed language entirely and went somewhere older. Somewhere that his dead magic lived, that hollow room, and filled it briefly with something that resonated like a struck bell. He remembered the mosaic above them, the unfinished face looking down, and thinking distantly that it was finished now, that the face had always been finished, that the tesserae had simply been waiting for the right light. He remembered hands that were careful with him in a way that nothing had been careful with him in 3 seasons. He woke alone. The temple was intact. The basin was dry again. The candles had burned down to nothing hours, then. He had been here hours. The light through the entrance arch was the deep gray of very early morning, which meant he had lost the better part of a night. He sat up slowly. His body felt strange, full. The specific fullness of something that has been empty long enough that fullness has become unfamiliar, and the unfamiliarity registers as wrongness before it registers as anything else. His hand was healed. The cut on his palm closed. Not scarred. Closed cleanly in the way that Fey healing worked, except that his magic was gone and Fey healing required. He pressed his other hand flat against his sternum. Deep in his chest, in the hollow room, something beat. Quiet. Steady. New. He sat in the pale stone chamber with the worn pathways on the floor and the mosaic on the wall and the dawn coming gray through the entrance arch, and he breathed, and did not examine what was beating in him because examining it would require naming it, and naming it would require him to know what it was. He did not know what it was yet. He would know in 7 weeks. 7 weeks was long enough to become certain. It was also, Caliph had discovered, exactly long enough to build an architecture of denial sophisticated enough to be mistaken for acceptance. He had spent the first 2 weeks telling himself it was the temple. Threshold spaces did things to Fey biology. Everyone knew this, it was documented. The archive had 17 separate case studies of court members returning from boundary territories with temporary physiological irregularities that resolved within a lunar cycle. Sensitivity to temperature. Disrupted sleep. The sensation of a second heartbeat in the chest that was not a second heartbeat but a residual echo of contact with old magic. He had read all 17 case studies in the archive. None of them described this. The changes were small at first, the way the most significant things tend to begin. Small enough that he could file them under other categories, under fatigue, under the cumulative physiological cost of 3 seasons of sustained tension, under the kind of bodily disruption that a magicless Fey prince living on the 3rd step from the bottom and eating with the consistency of someone who kept forgetting that eating was a requirement, not a luxury, might reasonably expect. He was tired in a way that sleep did not address. Not the tired of insufficient rest, but the tired of a body that was spending its resources on something other than the tasks he was assigning it. Something internal, something that was drawing on reserves he hadn't known he had and converting them to purposes he hadn't authorized. His senses had sharpened. Uncomfortably. The court had always been a sensory environment, the perfumes, the food, the particular combination of magic from dozens of Fey in close proximity producing a kind of ambient pressure he had learned to filter, but now the filtering had stopped working and everything arrived at full intensity, unmediated. The scent of the kitchen 3 corridors away reached him in his chamber and turned his stomach before he had identified what it was. Lyra's soap, which she had used for the entire duration of their association without incident, had required him to ask her, very carefully, if she might consider a different variety, without being able to explain why. She had looked at him for a long moment. She had changed her soap without asking questions. He loved her for that, in the specific way he loved the few things that remained uncomplicated. In the 5th week, his body began to change in ways that crossed from the category of explicable irregularity into something that had no category in any physiological text he had access to. He spent 3 days in the archive, methodically, working through the medical compendium that the court physic had assembled over the last century. He read it the way he had learned to read everything since the rite, without hope or dread, just collection. Just information. He found nothing that described what was happening to him. He found one thing that came close. In the oldest section of the compendium, the part copied from texts that predated the current court by several centuries, a case study written in the cramped, precise hand of a physic who had clearly been troubled by what they were recording. The subject was not named. The physic had written around the subject's identity with the careful avoidance of someone who understood that documentation could outlast discretion. But the symptoms were there. The fatigue, the sensory amplification, the changes in the body's architecture that should have been impossible for a male Fae and were occurring anyway because the biological rules of male Fae had apparently not been consulted. At the bottom of the case study, the physic had written one line that was not clinical. God-touched, it said. The old kind. Nothing to be done. Caliph sat with the compendium open on the archive table for a long time. Then he closed it, replaced it in its section, and walked back to his chamber with his spine straight and his hands still and his mind doing the thing it did with information that had no actionable conclusion. Filing it, not in the place where he put things he had accepted, but in the place where he put things he was going to have to accept eventually and was not ready for yet. He pressed his hands against his abdomen in the privacy of his chamber. Beneath his palms, quiet and steady and entirely without his permission, something moved. The court physic came on a Tuesday. Caliph had not summoned him. This was the detail that mattered. He had not summoned him, which meant someone else had, which meant someone else had noticed, which meant the architecture of concealment he had been building for 7 weeks had a crack in it he had not identified. The physic was a small man named Drevith who had served the court for 30 years and had the particular expression of someone who has seen enough that surprise has become theoretically possible but practically unlikely. He examined Caliph with the efficient detachment of his profession, speaking very little, his hands competent and impersonal in the way that medical competence tends to be impersonal when the practitioner has learned that warmth during examination creates complications. Then he stopped, his hands stilled. His expression, which had been professionally neutral for the entire examination, did something that Caliph watched with the focused attention of someone tracking a very important piece of information. It went pale. Not dramatically, just the blood making a quiet decision to be somewhere other than the face. Drevith straightened. He looked at Caliph. Something moved through his eyes that was not quite pity and not quite fear and was some third thing that existed in the space between them. Then he gathered his instruments with hands that were not quite steady, and walked to the door and left. He did not speak. He did not return. 3 days. Caliph gave it 3 days, because 3 days was the reasonable window for a court physic to process an unusual finding and determine the appropriate protocol for reporting it. He used those 3 days to complete his own processing, which involved the archive, the old compendium, 2 sleepless nights, and one morning where he sat on the floor of his chamber with his back against the wall and his hands pressed to his abdomen and allowed himself, for exactly the duration it took the court bell to ring the 6th hour, to not be composed. The bell rang. He stood up. He washed his face. He dressed with the precision that had become his primary form of self-respect. Every garment correct, every detail considered, because if the court was going to look at him, it was going to find nothing it could use. He ate something because the body required it regardless of what he thought about the situation. He made the calculations. The physic had seen enough to go pale and leave without speaking. He had not gone to Uldren immediately. If he had, Caliph would have known within hours. The court moved too fast for that kind of silence to hold. He had gone somewhere else or he had gone nowhere and was simply sitting with the knowledge the way Caliph was sitting with it, which was its own kind of answer. The court did not yet know. He had time. He did not know how much. He needed to determine what he was going to do with whatever time he had, which required him to first determine what his options were, which required him to be honest about the situation in a way he had been carefully avoiding for 7 weeks. He was carrying something. It was alive. It was the Enigmas, and the Enigma had not returned. He came back on a night when Caliph had stopped expecting him. This was not entirely accurate. Caliph had stopped consciously expecting him, which was not the same thing as his body having stopped listening for that specific drop in temperature, that specific shift in the quality of air that preceded the scent. His body had been listening for it for 7 weeks without his authorization. He had filed this also in the category of things without actionable conclusions. He was at his desk. Late. The court had gone quiet around him. The particular silence of a large building after the last of its inhabitants have stopped performing wakefulness and given in to sleep. He was working through correspondence that he was technically still expected to manage, minor diplomatic missives that came to the royal family's collective address and were distributed by the Chamberlain's office with the practiced neutrality of someone delivering documents to their destination without acknowledging what the destination had become. The temperature dropped. His pen stopped moving. He did not turn immediately. He finished the character he had been writing, completed it precisely because it would have been incomplete otherwise, and set the pen down and turned in his chair. The Enigma was standing near the far wall of his chamber. Not at the door. Not at the window. Near the wall, in the shadow between the candlelight's reach and the darkness of the corner, with the quality of presence that suggested the room had not been entered so much as remembered into containing him. He was looking at Caliph. That same quality of attention. Confirming. Already decided. Caliph stood. He did it slowly, the way he did everything now that his body had opinions about speed and effort that he had not previously been required to negotiate with. He faced the Enigma across the chamber. Outside, the court was quiet. The candles burned at their normal level. "You didn't run," the Enigma said. His voice. That frequency. Caliph felt it in his chest before his ears processed it. Felt the thing that was living in him respond to it the way it had in the temple when the rite had completed. A quickening, small and involuntary, the biological equivalent of recognition. "Where would I go?" Caliph said. A pause. The Enigma looked at him, all of him, the way he had in the temple, and then with a specificity that had not been there before, his gaze moving to the slight change in Caliph's silhouette that 7 weeks had produced, still concealable, still within the margin of what careful dressing could manage, but there, present, undeniable to someone who was looking for it. Something crossed the Enigma's expression. Caliph watched it happen because he was watching everything now with the intensity of someone who has very little power and is compensating with attention. It was not surprise. He had suspected it would not be surprise. The old compendium had said he already knows, not in those words but in the implication of the single line at the bottom, the old kind, nothing to be done, which was the language of something already in motion, not something being discovered. It was relief. Quiet and vast, and something that had clearly been held for a long time under considerable pressure. The expression of something that has been waiting for a specific outcome to confirm itself and has just received that confirmation and can now, finally, stop holding the question. "You knew," Caliph said. Not an accusation. A fact being placed on the table between them. "Yes," the Enigma said. "Before I did." "Yes." Caliph looked at him. The fallen god in his chamber, in the shadow between candlelight and dark, with his ancient rain and cold iron and the thing that had no name because it predated naming. The one who had given him something in the temple that he could not remember with clarity, but that his body had been remembering with absolute precision for 7 weeks. "You should have told me," Caliph said. "Yes," the Enigma said. "I should have." He did not explain why he hadn't. Caliph had expected defense or deflection, or the kind of justification that people produced when they had done something they couldn't fully justify. He had not expected bare agreement, offered without softening. It landed differently than he had prepared for. "I don't know what you are," Caliph said. "I know what the texts call you. I don't know what you actually are. No one does anymore." Something in his expression shifted, not self-pity, which would have been easier to categorize. Something more careful. "I'm not certain I do. What happened to you?" "I was set down." "Why?" The Enigma was quiet for a moment. The candlelight moved. The shadow between them held. "Because I kept interfering," he said finally, "in things I was told were not my concern." "Were they your concern?" "Yes." "Then why did you stop?" "I didn't stop." He looked at Caliph with that ancient, confirming attention. "I was removed. There is a difference." Caliph absorbed this. He had been removed from things too. He understood, with the specific comprehension of shared experience, the difference between stopping and being stopped, the difference between a choice and an architecture built around you while you weren't paying attention. He looked at the fallen god in his chamber and felt, against every calculation he had made in 7 weeks, the specific sensation of his anger arriving. Not at the Enigma, or not only at the Enigma, at all of it. The rite, the temple, the 7 weeks of silence, the physic's pale face, the correspondence he was still expected to manage, the third step from the bottom, his brother's pleasant voice explaining that he had needed the magic more than Caliph did, the basin in the vet his temple that had been dry for years and had filled with water the moment something older than the court had decided to pay attention. He crossed the chamber. He stopped 2 feet from the Enigma and looked up at him, He was tall, that unreasonable height that was not about measurement, and said very quietly, "I am carrying something I did not choose. In a court that will use it to destroy me if they find out. Without magic to protect myself or what I'm carrying. And you have been, where, exactly, for 7 weeks?" The Enigma looked at him. That quality of attention, but different now. The same confirmation but with something underneath it that had not been there in the temple, in the Solen Hall, in any of the moments Caliph had catalogued. Something that had been held behind the ancient patience and the fallen gods remove and was present now, close to the surface, because Caliph was standing 2 feet from him asking a direct question in the voice of someone who had earned the right to a direct answer. He reached out, slowly, deliberately, the same careful movement as in the temple. He pressed one hand flat against the side of Caliph's face. Not his jaw, not pulling him anywhere, just there. The warmth of it arrived before the cold did, the same paradox as the temple, and Caliph felt his dead magic surge, and felt the thing that was living in him surge in response, and stood very still because he was not going to step back. He had decided he was not going to step back. "I was here," the Enigma said. His voice had dropped to a register that was almost below speech. "Every night. You were never alone. I didn't see you. No. That's not the same as being here." "No," he said again. "It isn't." His thumb moved, once, the smallest possible motion, against Caliph's cheekbone. The gesture of something that had been waiting a very long time to be permitted to do exactly this and was not allowing itself more than it had been given permission for. Caliph's breath left him. The anger did not leave. It remained exactly where it was, legitimate and unresolved, a fact on the table between them. But underneath it, something else. Something his body had been doing for 7 weeks without his authorization. Something his dead magic had been moving toward since the first time the scent crossed the Solen Hall. Arrived with the quiet inevitability of a conclusion that the evidence had been building toward all along. He did not step back. "You are not going to disappear again," Caliph said. "Not a question." "No," the Enigma said. "I need your word. Whatever your word is worth." Something moved through the fallen god's expression. Vast and quiet and older than the court and older than the Fae and older than the language they were speaking in, and underneath all of that age, the specific, devastating simplicity of something that has found the thing it was looking for and is not going to let it go. "My word," he said, "is the only thing that was never taken from me." He said it like it cost him something to say it. Like it was not a reassurance but a transfer. Something that had been entirely his, now shared, now binding in both directions. Caliph looked at him for a long moment. Then he stepped back. Not retreat, not rejection. The deliberate step of someone establishing the distance required to think clearly. "Sit down," Caliph said. "There are things we need to discuss." The Enigma sat, and in the candlelit chamber, in the court that had forgotten about the 3rd step from the bottom and the prince who stood on it, the Fae with no magic and the god who had been set down began the negotiation of what came next. Outside, unnoticed, the flowers in the window box, dead since the rite, 3 seasons without tending, opened, one by one, in the middle of the night, because something in the chamber had remembered how. Subscribe now, because what gets negotiated in that room is not what either of them expects. And the brother is already moving. They talked until the 4th bell. Not about everything. Caliph was too precise for everything. He had learned, in 3 seasons of reduced circumstance, that the most dangerous thing a person without power could do was spend their information freely. Information was the only currency the court had not been able to reassign away from him, and he had hoarded it with the discipline of someone who understood that the day would come when he would need it and would need all of it. But he talked. More than he had talked to anyone since the rite, more than the careful minimums he had trained himself to in the court's common spaces, more than the quiet exchanges with Lyra that he valued precisely because they required so little explanation. The Enigma listened. This was the first thing Caliph catalogued about him, in the new file he had opened for information that was not yet actionable but would be. He listened the way very few things listened. Not waiting for the pause that indicated his turn. Not constructing his response while Caliph was still speaking. Actually receiving, the whole of it, the words and the gaps between the words and the things that the words were standing in front of, the way a deep body of water receives whatever enters it. Completely. Without editorial. It was unsettling. Caliph was accustomed to speaking into rooms that were already half full of the listener's own conclusions. He was not accustomed to this, the sensation of being heard all the way to the back of the sentence. He told the enigma about the physic, about the 7 weeks, about the compendium and the case study and the one line at the bottom written in the hand of someone who had been troubled by what they were recording. He told him about the court's peripheral vision, which was the most dangerous kind, and about Uldren's capacity for the kind of patience that looked like stillness and was actually accumulation. He did not tell him about the morning on the floor, the 6th bell, the one unrepeatable moment of allowing himself to not be composed. That he kept. The enigma, in return, told him very little. But what he told him, he told completely. He had known about Caliph before the Solen Hall. He did not say how long. He said only that the Fey Court had been within his awareness for a long time and that within that awareness Caliph had been specific, a particular point of attention. Not because of his magic, though his magic had been remarkable. Because of the quality of his stillness. Because of the way he moved through rooms that had decided not to see him as though the not seeing was their deficiency rather than his. Too particular, Caliph's brother had said. The enigma said it differently. He said, "You were the only one in that court who looked at the world as it actually was." Caliph had looked at him for a long moment after that. "That's not a gift." "No," the enigma had agreed. "It isn't." He told him that the temple had not been accidental, not engineered, not manipulated, but not accidental. He had been in the between space when Caliph arrived. He had felt the blood offering and the spoken dedication and the failed rite and the particular quality of someone completing a thing they knew would not work because they had said they would complete it. And something in him, something that had been very still for a very long time, had moved. "You should have asked," Caliph said. "Yes. That's twice you've said yes to that. It will be true as many times as you say it." Caliph had looked at him across the desk in the candlelit chamber and felt the anger again. And underneath the anger something he was not going to name yet because naming it would require him to have decided something he was not prepared to have decided. "The child," he said instead. The enigma's expression did the quiet, vast thing. "What is it?" Caliph said. "What will it be?" "I don't know exactly. Approximate." A pause. "Fey, mostly. But with something underneath that the court won't have a category for. Something old. Something that will make certain people very afraid and certain other people very determined to control it." "Uldren." "Yes. He'll move when he finds out." "He's already moving," the enigma said. "He found out 2 days ago." The silence that followed was the specific silence of a calculation being run very fast. Caliph sat with it, did not let it show on his face. Ran the variables, the physic, pale and silent, who had gone somewhere after leaving the chamber, and had clearly gone to someone, and that someone had clearly been Uldren or Uldren adjacent, and 2 days was enough time for Uldren to have assessed the information and determined his first move and begun implementing it with the pleasant efficiency that characterized everything he did. "What does he know?" Caliph said. "That you are carrying. He doesn't know what fathered it." "How long before he finds out?" "He has people looking. The temple, the vet his right, he knows you were there. He's making connections." "How long?" Caliph said again, precise. "Days. Perhaps a week." "A week." He sat with this too. A week was workable. A week was not comfortable, not generous, but workable, if he knew what he was working toward, and if he had resources he had not yet fully inventoried. He looked at the enigma. "What can you do?" he said. "Specifically, what are you capable of?" Something shifted in the fallen god's expression. Not offense, nothing so reactive as offense. More like the adjustment of someone who has been asked a question they are accustomed to being the only one who asks. He considered it genuinely. "Less than I was," he said finally. "I was stripped, not emptied. There is a difference. I know the difference intimately. What remains? Enough to move unseen through spaces that are not fully in the mortal world. Enough to affect certain physical things, temperature, light, the behavior of thresholds. Enough to protect what I have claimed, within the limits of what claiming costs." "What does claiming cost?" A pause. "Visibility. Every time I act on behalf of something in this world, I become more detectable to the ones who set me down. Will they interfere? If they believe I am reasserting a divine claim, if I act like a god, can you act like something else? He looked at Caliph. That confirming attention. I can try. That's not confidence-inspiring. No, he agreed. But it's honest. Caliph stood. He moved to the window, not to look out. The window faced the inner courtyard, and the inner courtyard was not interesting to him at this hour, but to create movement, to give his body something to do while his mind worked. He pressed his fingertips to the cold glass. Outside, the window box flowers were still open. Impossible. Wrong season. Wrong hour. Wrong everything. He looked at them for a moment. The child will be visible, he said. Not a question. When it arrives, yes. Fey children born with divine inheritance don't hide easily. So I cannot conceal it past birth. No. Then concealment is not the strategy. He turned from the window. Positioning is. The Enigma looked at him. If Uldren reaches me before I have established a position that makes me untouchable, Caliph said, the child becomes a resource he can manage. An heir of uncertain parentage that the crown can absorb, control, assign a narrative to. My word against his about its origin. And I have no magic and no standing, and he has the court. He crossed back to the desk. But if the father is known, if the father is present and claiming, the calculus changes. You want me to declare myself. I want to understand what declaring yourself costs. A long pause. Everything I told you about visibility, the Enigma said, multiplied. A public divine claim is not a border action. It is the thing they exiled me to prevent. Will they come? Eventually. How eventually? Long enough that it may not matter. Caliph looked at him. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have. He held Caliph's gaze. I won't lie to you about the risk. No, Caliph said slowly. I don't think you will. He sat back down. The candles had burned lower hours, the long hours of the night running out at the edges. Then we don't declare. Not yet. We buy time with a different move. What move? I leave the court. He said it the way he said everything that had been decided before it was spoken. Flatly, without performance, as a fact being placed on the table rather than an idea being floated. Before Uldren acts, he continued. If I am here when he moves, I am reacting. If I am already gone, the board is different. Where? The between space. Where you go. The place that is neither court nor mortal world. He looked at the Enigma steadily. Can I be there? You are Fey. The between space is not designed for. Can I be there? A pause. Something moved through the fallen god's expression. That quality of being asked something he was not accustomed to being asked. With me, he said finally. If you are with me, yes. Then that is the first move. Caliph looked at him. I leave before the week is out. Lyra comes. We do not announce. We do not explain. I become unavailable. Uldren will send people. Let him send people to the between space, Caliph said. Let me see which of his court survives that errand. Something happened to the Enigma's expression. It was small. So small that in a room with different lighting, in a conversation with less attention being paid, it might have been missed entirely. The corner of his mouth. Not a smile, not quite. The ghost of something that might become a smile if it were given the right conditions. The way certain seeds look inert until they are given water and then become something entirely different. It was the first crack. Caliph saw it and filed it in the place where he kept things that mattered. He told Lyra the next morning. Not all of it. The essential architecture. They were leaving soon, before the week was out, to a location he would explain when they arrived, and she needed to pack what she could not replace because they were not coming back for anything left behind. Lyra listened. She was standing at the window with the morning light coming in at the angle that made her look older than she was, which she would have hated if she'd known, and she listened to everything he said with the quality of attention she had always given him. Complete, without editorial, the way she had always listened even when what he was telling her required her to rearrange her understanding of what her life was. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. The thing in the Solen Hall, she said. The one that made the temperature drop. Yes. Is it? She stopped. Reconsidered. Is it safe? I don't know what safe means in this context. Is it going to hurt you? Caliph thought about the temple, the careful hands, the word given like a transfer, the flowers in the window box opening in the middle of the night because something in the chamber had remembered how. No, he said. Lyra looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the window. I'll need 2 days to prepare without anyone noticing. You have 2 days. Will it be here? In the chamber? When I need to. She paused. When we need to go. Yes. Does it have a name? Caliph considered. The texts call it the Enigma. Lyra absorbed this with the equanimity she brought to most things. Right, she said. I'm going to need a better soap. The letter from Uldren arrived that afternoon. It was formal, perfectly structured, the letterhead immaculate. The wax seal pressed with the precision of someone who understood that the appearance of a communication could convey as much as its content. Caliph broke the seal and read it at his desk with the expression of someone reading a weather report for a region they had no intention of visiting. The letter was an invitation, a formal summons to an audience with the Crown Prince, framed as brotherly concern, citing reports from the court physic, unnamed, referenced only as a member of the court's medical establishment, indicating that Caliph's health might benefit from the court's attention and resources. The tone was solicitous. The subtext was a door being closed before the subject could reach it. I thought of you immediately, Uldren had said at the Solen Hall. The pleasant voice, the administrative cruelty. He was still thinking of Caliph immediately. Caliph set the letter on the desk and pressed his fingertips together and thought about his brother. Really thought in the way he rarely permitted himself because it cost something he had learned to ration. Thought about the sanctum, the right, the flat explanatory tone. I needed it more than you did. Thought about the pleasant efficiency of someone who had made a decision and organized the world around it and could not imagine the world organizing itself around something else. Uldren was afraid of him. He had always been afraid of him. Too particular, too clear-eyed, too precise. The kind of person who looked at things as they actually were, which was the most dangerous thing to have in your court if you needed the court to agree on a version of events that was not entirely accurate. He had taken the magic because without it, Caliph became manageable. He had miscalculated. Caliph picked up his pen. He wrote a response to the letter, brief, courteous, regretful, citing the press of certain obligations that would prevent him from attending the requested audience for the next several days, and expressing his sincere hope that they might find a time soon to speak. He sealed it with his own mark, which was not the royal seal and had not been the royal seal since the right but was still his, still legitimate, still the mark of a fey prince of the blood regardless of what the third step from the bottom implied. He sent it with a page. He had perhaps 4 days. On the third night, the Enigma came back. He came back every night now. Caliph had not asked for this and had not acknowledged that it was happening, and the Enigma had not announced it or explained it. He simply appeared in the shadow between the candlelight and the corner, when the court had gone quiet, and remained for the hours Caliph worked, and left before the dawn. He did not always speak. This was the second thing Caliph catalogued about him. He was comfortable with silence in the way that things are comfortable with silence when they have lived long enough that silence has become a texture rather than an absence. He did not fill the room with himself. He occupied his corner and his quiet and let Caliph have the rest of the space without making it about the occupation. Caliph worked. Correspondence, archive records, the logistical details of a departure that needed to look like nothing from the outside. Occasionally he asked the Enigma a question about the between space, about what to expect, about the physical experience of threshold crossing for a fae without active magic. And the Enigma answered directly without elaboration unless elaboration was asked for. On the third night, near the second bell, the Enigma crossed the chamber without preamble and set something on the desk beside Caliph's correspondence. A small carved object. Stone, dark, smoothed by age to the point where the original edges were implied rather than present. A shape that was almost a bird and almost something else, older than birds, possibly, or from a taxonomy of living things that no longer had living members. Caliph looked at it. Then at the Enigma. Third shelf, the Enigma said. 5 back. It will be easier to find when you need it. What will I need it for? You'll know. Caliph looked at him for a long moment. The candlelight moved. The carved object sat on the desk between his correspondence and his ink pot, small and dark and older than the court and older than the Fae and apparently waiting to be needed. He picked it up. It was warm. Not from the Enigma's hands, warm in itself, the way certain old things are warm because they have absorbed enough of the world to hold it. He set it on the third shelf. 5 back. Thank you, he said. The Enigma looked at him. Something in his expression again. That vast, quiet thing that was not grief and not relief and was older than both. Something that had been held for a very long time and was finding, in this chamber, in these nights, in this specific Fey prince with his straight spine and his dead magic and his flat voice asking direct questions, a place to be set down carefully. I've been carrying that since before your court was built, the Enigma said quietly. Caliph looked at the shelf. At the small dark shape, 5 back. Why now? Because this is where it belongs. He said it simply. The way he said things that were simply true. Without performance. Without the weight of implication which was its own kind of weight. Caliph absorbed it the way he absorbed everything, completely without showing the full extent of the absorption. He turned back to his correspondence. His dead magic beat in his chest. The thing that was living in him beat alongside it. Outside, the flowers in the window box held. On the 4th morning, Uldren sent a second letter. It was shorter than the first. The tone had not changed. Still solicitous, still formally structured, still the letterhead and the wax and the impression of concern. But underneath the structure something had shifted. The patience that looked like stillness was showing its other face. I must insist, the letter said near the end. 2 words. Unremarkable in isolation. The most significant thing Uldren had written to him since the flat explanatory tone in the sanctum. I must insist. Caliph read them twice. Set the letter down. Looked at the third shelf. 5 back. Stood up from his desk and went to find Lyra. They were leaving tonight. They left at the 3rd bell. Not dramatically. This was the thing Caliph had planned most carefully. The leaving could not look like flight because flight implied something to flee from, and something to flee from implied guilt, and guilt was the one currency Uldren could use to reframe everything that came after. So they left the way water leaves a vessel, quietly, completely, without announcing the moment of departure. Lyra had packed 2 bags. 1 each. She had done it over 3 days, moving things in small increments, the way you move anything important when you cannot afford to be seen moving it. 1 item at a time, redistributed among ordinary objects so that the chamber looked inhabited until it didn't, and by the time it didn't they would already be gone. Caliph packed less. He took the correspondence he could not leave, certain documents from the archive, certain records that Uldren would find useful if left behind and that usefulness needed to be denied him. He took the ceremonial blade. He took the carved object from the 3rd shelf, 5 back, wrapping it in a square of cloth and placing it at the bottom of the bag where it would not shift. He did not look at the chamber when he left it. He had learned this: you did not look back at the spaces you were leaving because the spaces did not care and the looking only cost you. He had not looked back at the sanctum after the rite. He had not looked back at the upper dais steps when his marker moved down. He walked out of his chamber at the 3rd bell with his bag over his shoulder and his spine straight and his face in the expression that was present and attentive and entirely unreachable, and he did not look back. Lyra was waiting in the corridor. She had her bag and her new soap and the particular expression she wore when she had committed to something and was not going to discuss it further. He had always found this quality in her deeply restful. They moved through the court's back corridors, the service passages, the routes used by staff and pages and the invisible people who maintained the machinery of a large household. Caliph had memorized these routes in the weeks after the rite, when he had needed to move through the court without being moved through it, without performing his reduced presence for an audience that had not yet agreed to stop watching. The service passages were empty at the 3rd bell. The court slept. The night guards were stationed at the formal entrances, at the gates, at the points of entry that a person fleeing would logically use, because Uldren would have considered the logical exits. Uldren had not considered the door behind the old laundry. It was not on any current map. Caliph had found it in the archive, in the building records from 3 centuries ago, when the court had been smaller and less deliberate about its own geography. A door in the east foundation wall, below the level of the formal chambers, that had been sealed when the laundry was expanded and forgotten when the laundry was moved. Sealed in the Fey sense, mortared, not locked. He had spent an afternoon with a small tool and the patience of someone with nothing more urgent to do, and the mortar had come away, and behind it the door had been exactly where the archive said it would be. He was grateful now for 3 seasons of nothing to do but learn the building. They reached the door. He pressed it open. It moved stiffly, the way things move when they have been still for a long time and have developed opinions about it. Cold air from outside. The Enigma was on the other side. He was standing in the narrow gap between the court's outer wall and the foundation planting. A space so unremarkable that the night guards had clearly not considered it worth stationing anyone in. He was simply there, in the dark, with the cold that preceded him and the scent and the quality of presence that made the unremarkable space feel like the most significant point in the court's geography. He looked at Caliph, at Lyra, at the bags. "This is Lyra," Caliph said. The Enigma looked at her. Lyra looked at him with the expression of someone who had been told a thing and was now encountering the reality of the thing and finding that the reality was larger than the telling. To her considerable credit, she did not step back. "You're the Enigma," she said. "Yes," he said. "Right?" She looked at Caliph. "We're going through him." Through. "Adjacent to," the Enigma said. "Not through. Adjacent to what?" "The between space." He looked at her steadily. "You'll feel it as cold first, then as pressure, then as nothing for a moment. Don't fight the nothing." "What happens if I fight the nothing?" "It takes longer." Lyra absorbed this. "How much longer?" "Subjectively significant." She looked at Caliph again. "Trust him," Caliph said. He believed it when he said it. He noted that he believed it, filed it in the place where he kept things that mattered, did not examine it further. Lyra squared her shoulders, adjusted her bag strap, and said, "Fine, let's go." The between space was not what Caliph had prepared for. He had prepared for cold. The Enigma had said cold first, and cold was something he could calibrate against, a physical sensation with a known register. He had prepared for the pressure, which he had imagined as something like deep water, like weight distributed across the body from all directions. He had not prepared for the quality of it. It was like walking into the moment before a word is spoken, the space where the breath has been drawn and the mouth has formed the shape and the sound is entirely present in potential, and has not yet become actual, and exists in that instant with a completeness that the actual word will not quite match. Everything was there. Everything was about to be. Nothing had committed yet to being specifically itself. He understood in the between space why the fallen god had been exiled here. Not as punishment exactly, as containment of something too generative to leave loose in a world that had already committed to being specifically itself. Lyra made a sound beside him. Not distress, adjustment. The sound of a body recalibrating its relationship to space and finding the new parameters manageable but surprising. The Enigma walked ahead. Or walked was not quite the right word, moved through, with the ease of something that had spent long enough here that the between space had organized itself around his presence rather than the reverse. He did not look back to check on them. He moved with the certainty of something that knew they would follow because they were there and there was only one direction. The cold arrived as promised. Then the pressure. Then the nothing. Caliph did not fight it. He had an easier time with nothing than most. He had been practicing, in various forms, for 3 seasons. He let the nothing be nothing and moved through it with his bag over his shoulder and his spine straight, and on the other side, light. Not court light. Not the gold of the Solen Hall or the gray of early morning through stone windows. A different quality, diffuse, directionless, as though the light here had given up on having a source and was simply ambient, existing throughout rather than coming from anywhere. A space. Large, it was difficult to estimate scale because the usual anchors were absent, the usual relationship between a person and a room was absent. Not a room exactly. Not a landscape exactly. Something between, a space that had the qualities of both without committing to either. The temperature was stable. This surprised Caliph more than anything else. He had expected the between space to be cold throughout, an extension of the threshold cold. Instead it was neutral. The temperature of a body at rest. In one area of the space, corner was wrong, section was inadequate, there were things, objects, placed with the deliberate arrangement of someone who had been in a space long enough to make it habitable in the way that habitable is different from comfortable. A surface that functioned as a table. Things on the surface that functioned as the objects of a life, not many, not decorative. Necessary. And on a structure that functioned as a shelf, along the far wall. Objects. Many of them. All different. All old, the kind of old that is not about age exactly but about density, the way certain things accumulate meaning, the way stone accumulates heat. Small things, mostly. A fragment of something that might have been a vessel. A piece of dark metal that had no identifiable original shape. A cloth folded with deliberate care. Carving. Many carvings. Caliph looked at the shelf for a long moment. "You've been collecting them," he said. "Keeping them," the Enigma said. He was beside the surface, setting down something he had carried through that Caliph had not noticed him picking up. "There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Collecting is for the collector. Keeping is for the thing." Caliph looked at the shelf, at the many small dark shapes, each one old, each one placed with the specific deliberateness of someone who understood that placement was a form of care. He reached into his bag, took out the cloth-wrapped object from the third shelf, 5 back, unwrapped it. He looked at the Enigma. "Where?" he said. Something in the fallen god's expression. That vast, quiet thing. He crossed to the shelf, indicated a space not arbitrary considered the way the original placement had been considered. Left of center, between the folded cloth and a piece of something that had once been glass. Caliph placed it there. The between space was silent in the way that spaces are silent when they are full rather than empty. Lyra, who had been standing slightly apart taking inventory of her surroundings with the expression of someone who had decided that functional adaptation was more useful than reaction, said, "Is there somewhere to sleep?" There was. The between space provided, not magically, not conjured, but in the way that a space occupied long enough accumulates utility. Surfaces that could function as sleep spaces, if sleep was what was needed. The light dimmed when it was not needed and returned when it was, and whether this was the Enigma or the space itself or some collaboration between the two, Caliph did not ask because the answer would not change what he did with it. He slept for the first time in weeks without calculating anything. He did not examine this when he woke. He filed it. Lyra slept beside him, which she would not have done in the court and which she did here with the pragmatic flexibility of someone whose understanding of the rules had been sufficiently revised that the old hierarchies were temporarily suspended. The Enigma did not sleep, or did not sleep in any register that Caliph could detect. He was present when Caliph woke, in the area of the space near the shelf, existing with the quality of something that has been still for a long time and is still by choice rather than limitation. They established a rhythm. It happened without discussion, the way the rhythms of close spaces tend to happen, gradually through repetition, through the accumulation of small choices that eventually calcify into structure. Caliph worked in the mornings, by which he meant the period after waking that he designated as morning regardless of the light's opinion. He went through his archive documents, organized his records, thought through the variables of their position with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had learned that the alternative to thinking was being surprised. The Enigma was present for this and was quiet for this, and occasionally Caliph asked him something and he answered, and the answers were direct and without elaboration and occasionally contained information that reconfigured the variables significantly, which Caliph noted without comment and integrated without ceremony. Lyra managed the logistics of habitation with the competence she brought to everything. She found in the between space that certain things she had brought, food primarily, maintained themselves differently here. Time moved oddly in the between space. Not dangerously, not traumatically, but with the looseness of something that had not committed to its own passage. A week here might not correspond precisely to a week in the court. This was inconvenient in some ways and useful in others, and Caliph was focused on the useful. On what he had calculated was the third day his dead magic surged. Not the familiar pulse, not the steady beat that had developed since the temple. A surge. The whole of it, the hollow room, lit briefly from within with something that was not his magic but was using the space where his magic used to live as a vessel. A temporary residence for something that wanted to make itself known. He was at the table when it happened. His hand jerked, knocked the ink pot, caught it before it fell. Reflexes still precise, still reliable, and set it right and sat very still with his hand flat on the documents and the surge moving through him like a wave through water, not destructive, just present. Insisting, he pressed his free hand to his abdomen. Movement, not metaphorical, not the vague awareness of presence that had been his companion for weeks. Movement, small, definite, the movement of something that had decided to demonstrate its reality in unmistakable terms. Caliph sat with this. He sat with it for a long time, through the fading of the surge and the settling of the between space back into its ambient quiet, his hand on his abdomen and his documents in front of him and the ink pot upright and everything orderly except for the thing happening in him that was not orderly, that had never been orderly, that had from the beginning refused to participate in the architecture of management he had built around it. He did not cry. He was not going to cry at a desk. But something happened in his chest that was not crying and was adjacent to it. A loosening, a brief failure of the architecture, the specific sensation of a wall doing its job entirely correctly and the thing behind it pressing against it anyway. Not because it wanted to get through but because it needed somewhere to press. He breathed. He was still sitting there when the Enigma crossed the space and stood beside the table. He did not say anything. He did not put a hand on Calith's shoulder or make any of the gestures that living creatures make when they detect another living creature in distress. He simply stood there, beside him, not over him, at a proximity that was present without being intrusive, with the quality of something that had been in many spaces during many moments and understood that sometimes the most significant thing you could offer was the specific gravity of being near. Caliph looked up at him. "It moved," he said. The Enigma looked at his hand, still pressed to his abdomen. Something crossed his expression that Caliph had not seen before. Not the vast, quiet thing. Not the ghost of the almost smile. Something that existed underneath both of those, older, rawer, the expression of something that has been alone for a very long time and has been given, without asking for it, a reason not to be. He lowered himself to one knee beside the table. Not a bow, nothing subservient. The deliberate choice to make himself level rather than above, to reduce the distance without reducing the space. He looked at Caliph at eye level, which was the first time they had been at eye level since the chamber, since I need your word, since the long negotiation of what came next. "May I?" he said. One of the shortest sentences he had spoken. The most careful. Caliph looked at him for a moment. Then he moved his hand. The Enigma placed his palm flat against Calith's abdomen. Gently. The paradox warmth again. Cold hands, warm contact, the thing underneath that had no register. In the between space, which had no flowers, something bloomed. Not literally, not the window box physics of the chamber. But in the quality of the air, in the ambient light, in some property of the space itself that the Enigma's presence had been slowly shaping for however long he had been here, something shifted. Opened. Became briefly more than it had been. The thing inside Caliph moved again. Toward the warmth. Caliph felt it and did not look away from the Enigma's face and did not manage, this time, to keep the architecture entirely intact. Not fully. Not catastrophically. Just the wall doing its job and one brick of it briefly not doing its job, and through that gap something true getting out. "I don't know how to do this," Caliph said. Quietly. The voice he used when he was not performing composure, which was a voice very few people had heard. "I know how to endure things. I don't know how to. I don't have a framework for this." The Enigma looked at him. "Neither do I," he said. "You're a god. I'm a fallen one." Something in his expression. "I know how to endure things too. I've been doing it for 1,000 years. This." His hand, still pressed flat, the warmth. "This is not something I have a framework for either. Then we're both improvising." "Yes." Caliph looked at him for a long moment. At this thing that had been set down and not ended, that had watched the Fey court from the between space and found one point of attention that was specific, that had come to a forgotten temple when summoned by someone completing a failed rite because they said they would, that had given its word like a transfer and had been in his chamber every night and had placed an old carved object on a shelf and knelt beside a table to ask permission. Something in Calith's chest. Not the dead magic. Not the thing that was living in him. Something that had been entirely his, that no succession right and no demotion and no pleasant efficient brother had been able to reach. Something so far inside the architecture that it had remained untouched through everything. He felt it move. He did not name it. He was not ready to name it. But he felt it move and he did not file it in the category of things without actionable conclusions, which was the first time he had not done that, which was its own kind of answer. The court will have noticed we're gone by now, he said. Yes. Uldren will be moving. Yes. We'll need to discuss the next move. When we're ready. Yes, the Enigma said. He had not moved his hand. When you're ready. Caliph looked at him. I'm ready now, he said. But he did not move to the documents. And the Enigma did not stand. And the between space held them in its ambient, sourceless light, and outside of it, in the court with its third step from the bottom and its pleasant efficient cruelties and its maps that ended at the tree line, Uldren was moving. He was one step behind. He had always been one step behind. He just didn't know it yet. The message arrived on what Caliph calculated was the 5th day. Not a letter. Letters required a carrier, and a carrier required access, and the between space did not offer access to people who did not already know where to arrive. Came in a different form. A sound, low and structural, that moved through the between space with the quality of something that had been sent from a long distance and had spent its journey becoming more serious. The Enigma heard it first. Caliph saw him go still, a different kind of still than his usual, not the stillness of patience but the stillness of attention suddenly narrowed to a point. What is that? Caliph said. Someone in the court is performing the old rites, the Enigma said. The old ones. Not the seasonal boundary work. The older ones. Caliph was very still. Who knows the older ones? Your brother has been in someone's archive. His expression had gone to something Caliph had not seen on him before. Not fear, but the close relative of it. Respect for a threat. He found something he should not have found. What is he trying to do? Call something. A pause. To find you. Can it? Not me. But you. He looked at Caliph. You are Fae. You are in the between space, but you are not of it. If the right is strong enough and the lineage connection is used correctly. He'll use my lineage against me, Caliph said. My own blood as a locator. Yes. Caliph stood. He moved to the table, to the documents, with the efficiency of someone who has just had their timeline revised and is integrating the revision. How long do we have, he said, before the rite completes? Hours. The Enigma crossed to him. But Caliph, this changes the position. I know. We can run deeper into the between space, further from the court's reach. But the further we go, the more your body. What? A pause. Something careful in the fallen god's expression. The between space is not built for Fae biology. For short durations, the effect is manageable. For longer. What effect? Caliph said. The Enigma looked at him. Time moves differently here. I told you. What is a week here may not be a week outside. For you, this is mostly inconvenient. For what you're carrying. He stopped. Caliph understood. He understood completely in the way he understood things that had no actionable conclusion. Fully, without flinching, and then immediately began looking for the action. The child cannot stay in the between space long term, he said. No. So we cannot hide here indefinitely. No. Then we are not hiding. Caliph looked at him. We were never hiding. We were buying time. Time for what? Time for me to figure out how to go back. The Enigma looked at him. Not to the court, Caliph said. Not to the third step from the bottom. Back. On my own terms. With a position that makes me untouchable. He looked at the shelf, at the small dark shapes, at the carved object 5 back from the folded cloth. You said a public divine claim changes everything. It risks everything. So does staying here. He met the Enigma's gaze directly. You said your word is the only thing that was never taken from you. Yes. Then I'm asking for it again. He stood straight. When we go back, and we are going back, you declare. Whatever it costs. Whatever visibility it brings. We go back to that court and we make them understand what they are dealing with. The Enigma looked at him for a long, steady moment. Outside the between space, in the court that had forgotten about the third step from the bottom, the old rite was building toward completion. Uldren was patient and efficient and one step behind, and he did not know yet that he was one step behind, which was the most dangerous version of him. You understand what this starts, the Enigma said. I understand what it ends, Caliph said. That's more important. The fallen god looked at him. He had been set down and not ended. He had watched from the between space for 1,000 years. He had found one point of attention that was specific and had placed a carved object on a shelf and given his word like a transfer and knelt beside a table to ask permission and held his palm flat against something that was alive because of him and had moved toward the warmth. Yes, he said. Not to the question. They were past questions. Yes to all of it. From the corner of the space, Lyra looked at both of them and said, very practically, so we're going back. Yes, Caliph said. To the court. Yes. Where your brother is currently performing ancient forbidden rites to locate us. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Do we have a plan? We have the beginning of one. She looked at the Enigma. And you're declaring yourself. Yes, he said. Lyra absorbed this. She straightened her bag strap. Right, she said. I'm going to need more than 2 days' worth of food for this. They returned on a morning the court did not expect. This was intentional. Uldren expected, had planned for, had organized his pieces around, a confrontation on his terms. A summons answered reluctantly. A fugitive returned by the pressure of the rites locating pull. A magicless prince delivered back to the court's geometry with the disadvantage of having fled written into his posture. Uldren was good at receiving people on his terms. He had been practicing since the sanctum. Caliph walked through the court's main gate at the 7th bell with his bag over his shoulder, and his spine straight and Lyra 3 inches behind his left shoulder exactly as she had always been, and the Enigma beside him. Not behind. Not ahead. Beside. The gate guard saw them and did the specific thing that people did when they encountered something their protocols had not prepared them for. He processed the components separately, failed to assemble them into a coherent category, and defaulted to the behavior his training had made automatic. He stepped aside. He let them through. They were inside before anyone had decided what to do about it. The court at the 7th bell was in its morning register. Staff moving through the corridors with purpose, the early rising lords already assembled in the breakfast hall, the machinery of the household running through its first rotations of the day with the efficiency of a system that had been doing this long enough to do it without thinking. Caliph moved through it the way he had always moved through it, with the knowledge of someone who had spent 3 seasons learning every corridor, every timing, every gap in the court's attention. He had planned the route. The route mattered. Not the back corridors this time. Not the service passages. The formal corridors. The ones with the high ceilings and the morning light coming through the eastern windows in long gold columns and the court's best portraits lining the walls. The route that everyone who mattered could see. They had taken perhaps 40 steps inside when the first person stopped. A lord, minor, border holdings, the kind of court presence that was more weather-vane than wind. He stopped in the corridor ahead of them and looked, and the looking had the quality of someone trying to identify the components separately and failing in the same way the gate guard had failed, because the components were Caliph, who was supposed to be fled or found or managed, and beside Caliph something that the lord's body understood before his mind did. Something that made his shoulders drop slightly, involuntarily, the way shoulders drop in the presence of something older than the instinct to hold them up. He stepped aside. They passed him. 3 more people in the next corridor. The same sequence, the looking, the failed categorization, the involuntary accommodation. The Enigma did nothing. He walked. He was simply present beside Caliph with the cold that preceded him and the scent and the quality of being that the court's architecture did not know how to contain because it had not been built for something like this. The paintings on the walls, old portraits, fey nobles from previous generations, seemed to watch them pass with the attentiveness of images that had always been still and were now finding stillness insufficient. Word moved through the court faster than they did. By the time they reached the formal corridor outside the great reception hall, there was an audience. Not assembled. The court was too well trained for assembly to look spontaneous. But present. In doorways, at the ends of corridors, in the gallery above the reception hall with its carved railing that had always been used for exactly this kind of watching. The court watching. Watching Caliph. Not with the peripheral attention of something not seeing him. Fully. Directly. For the first time in 3 seasons. He felt it land differently than he had expected. Not the satisfaction of vindication. He had never needed their attention, had built himself to function without it. Something quieter. The simple, factual acknowledgement that he was visible. That the third step from the bottom and its slightly lesser light and the smooth, practiced arc of his brother's gaze had been a condition, not a conclusion. He had always been here. They had simply stopped looking. They were looking now. Uldren met them in the reception hall. He had not had time to prepare fully. They had moved faster than the word, and the word had moved fast, and Uldren was adaptable, but adaptation required a moment, and Caliph had not given him the moment. He stood in the reception hall with two advisors and the court chamberlain, and the expression of someone who had been mid-calculation when the variables changed and was running the new numbers in real time. He looked at Caliph. He looked at Lyra. He looked at the Enigma. The advisors, to their credit, maintained their positions. The chamberlain took one step back without appearing to decide to do so. Uldren himself, and this was the thing Caliph watched most carefully, the thing he had been waiting to see, went very still. Not the stillness of patience. The stillness of something that has identified a threat and is determining the appropriate response before making any movement that cannot be retracted. He was afraid. Not of Caliph or not of Caliph alone. Of the variable beside Caliph that he had not accounted for and was now accounting for with the visible speed of a very capable mind encountering something it cannot immediately categorize. "Brother," Uldren said. His voice was pleasant. It was a remarkable instrument, that voice. "You've returned." "As you see," Caliph said. "And you've brought someone." "Yes." Uldren looked at the Enigma with the specific expression of a person who wants to assess something without revealing that the assessment is necessary. "I don't believe we've been introduced." The Enigma looked at Uldren. He did not speak immediately. He looked at him the way he looked at everything, completely without performance, receiving the whole of it. And then something happened that Caliph had not anticipated and that he would think about later, in the quieter spaces of what came after. The Enigma's expression, which had been the ancient neutral of something that did not find most things worth reacting to, shifted toward cold. Not the ambient cold that preceded him everywhere. Something directed. Something that had identified Uldren not as a political variable but as a specific fact, and the fact was, this was the one who had reached into the succession sanctum and taken what did not belong to him, from the one that did. The temperature in the reception hall dropped 4 degrees. Not gradually. "I know who you are," the Enigma said. 3 words. In the frequency that registered in the chest before the ears. The advisors shifted. The chamberlain, who had already taken 1 step back, was reassessing whether 1 step was sufficient. Uldren's pleasantness did not leave his face. But underneath it something moved, the machinery of the expression working harder than usual to hold the surface in place. "I'm afraid you have me at a disadvantage," Uldren said. "Yes," the Enigma said. "I do." The silence that followed was the specific silence of a room full of people who have understood simultaneously that the balance of a conversation has shifted and are waiting to find out what it shifts toward. Caliph let it hold for exactly the right duration. Then, "I'm not here for an audience, Uldren. I'm here to establish something. Clearly. In front of witnesses." He looked at his brother with the quality of attention that had always made Uldren uncomfortable. The looking that saw things as they actually were. "The child I'm carrying is not a resource for the court to manage. It is not an heir of uncertain parentage. Its parentage is standing beside me and will be recognized as such under whatever protocol the court requires." The room received this. "Caliph," Uldren began. "I'm not finished." He said it quietly, the voice that was not performing composure. "You sent me to the vet his temple to fail. I didn't fail. You sent your people into the between space to retrieve me. They didn't retrieve me. I came back because I chose to come back on my terms with my position established." He held his brother's gaze. "The right is complete. The lineage holds. And the one who fathered what I'm carrying has claimed it before witnesses." He paused. "You're 1 step behind, Uldren. You have always been 1 step behind. I've been courteous enough not to say so until now." Uldren looked at him. For a moment, one unguarded moment, in the reception hall with its witnesses and its morning light, the pleasant efficiency left his face entirely. What was underneath it was not what Caliph had expected. Not fury. Not cold calculation reorganizing. The same fear he had seen in the sanctum, translated across 3 seasons. Still there, still the root of everything. He had always been afraid of what Caliph saw. "What do you want?" Uldren said. "Recognition," Caliph said. "The child's lineage documented. My position restored, not the third step, Uldren. My position." A pause. "And the magic returned." "I can't." "You can," Caliph said. "I know you can because I know how it was taken. I spent 3 seasons in the archive." He let this sit. "I'm not asking for punishment. I'm not asking for confession. I'm asking for restitution." Quietly, between family. His voice was even. "The alternative is that the one standing beside me stops being quiet. I'm told that becomes complicated. For everyone." The Enigma said nothing. He did not need to. His presence in the room was doing its own work, in the drop temperature and the ancient weight of something that had been set down and was considering whether to remain set down. Uldren looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Caliph. "The child," he said carefully. "What is it?" "Mine," Caliph said. Simply. "That's all you need to know." Another long silence. Then Uldren nodded. Once. The nod of someone accepting terms they had not planned to accept, with the mind already working on what came after, what could be recovered, what new calculation could be built around the changed variables. He would never stop calculating. Caliph knew this. He had not come back expecting his brother to become a different person. He had come back expecting his brother to recognize a position that was no longer manageable. That was enough. The formal documentation took 3 days. Caliph spent those 3 days in his old chambers, his actual chambers upper level, the ones that had been maintained in his absence with the specific quality of maintenance applied to spaces that are officially inhabited by someone officially present, because the alternative was acknowledging that the prince had been gone, which would have required acknowledging why. His marker was on the upper dais steps again. No one had said anything about it. It had simply reappeared, the way things in courts reappeared when the geography shifted, without announcement, without acknowledgement, placed by hands that understood the new arrangement and adjusted accordingly. The magic came back on the second day. Not dramatically. Not the way it had left, which had been a taking, a reaching in, a deliberate subtraction that had felt like a sound being cut off mid-note. It came back the way it had always been before it was taken, the way he had never noticed it because it had always been there. Gradually, like feeling returning to a limb that has been held at a wrong angle, pins and needles and then warmth and then the specific relief of a body returning to what it was supposed to be doing. He was standing at the window when it happened. He pressed one hand to the glass and felt the magic move through him, through his chest, through his arms, through the specific channels it had always used, finding them intact, finding the paths clear, as though it had simply been stored somewhere waiting to be returned and the storage had kept it in good condition. In the courtyard below, every plant within 20 feet flowered simultaneously. He looked at them. Then he looked at his hands. He laughed. It was the first time he had laughed in 3 seasons and it surprised him with its own sound. Not the laughter of relief, not cathartic, just genuine, just his body responding to something that was simply and completely funny. The excessive punctuation of it, the flowers again, the way his magic had always refused to be subtle about its own presence. Lyra, from the chair she had taken up near the fire with the adaptability that characterized everything about her, looked up. "The flowers," she said. "The flowers," he agreed. She smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that was more about the eyes than the mouth. "Good," she said, and returned to what she was reading. The Enigma came to him that night. Not in the between-space ambient light, not in the shadow of the corner with the candlelight at its slightly lesser level. The chamber was warm. A fire in the grate, the magic returning in small demonstrations that he was still calibrating, the light burning at full and even and consistent gold. He came through the window, not dramatically, not through the glass, not in a way that would have been performance. He was simply on the wrong side of the window and then on the right side with the between-space logic applied locally, the logic of thresholds that he had been navigating for 1,000 years. Caliph was at the desk. He turned when the temperature shifted. They looked at each other across the chamber. Something had changed. Not in the between-space slow accumulation. Not in the gradual revolution of the long negotiations and the cold corridor mornings and the fourth bell conversations. Something had changed today in the reception hall in the 3 words the Enigma had said to Uldren. "I know who you are," with the cold directed and specific. In the way he had stood beside Caliph and not behind him and not in front of him but exactly level, exactly present, without being asked to be. Caliph stood. He crossed the chamber. He did not wait at the desk. Did not maintain the distance that he had maintained in every previous version of this, the careful measured space of someone rationing their proximity. He crossed the chamber fully and stopped in front of the Enigma and looked up at him and said quietly, without the composure that was not performing composure, "You said I was the only one in that court who looked at the world as it actually was." "Yes," the Enigma said. "Then I'm going to tell you what I actually see." The Enigma was still. "I see something that was set down and not ended," Caliph said. "That watched from the between space because it could not stop caring about what it was watching. That came to a forgotten temple not because it was summoned but because it recognized something." He held the fallen god's gaze. "I see something that has been alone for 1,000 years and does not know how not to be, and is learning, and is being careful about the learning because it understands that careful matters." He paused. "I see something that knelt beside a table to ask permission and waited and placed objects on shelves and stood beside me in a room full of people who were afraid of it, and did not use that fear for anything except keeping me safe." The Enigma looked at him. That expression. The vast, quiet thing. But closer to the surface now than it had ever been. Not held back by the ancient remove. Not managed by the patience of something that has endured long enough to make patience into armor. Close. Raw. The expression of something that has been seen, fully, by someone who looks at things as they actually are, and does not know yet what to do with being seen. "Caliph," he said, "I'm not finished." He stopped. "I don't have a framework for this," Caliph said. "I told you that in the between space. I still don't. I know how to endure things and I know how to calculate things and I know how to stand on the third step from the bottom and keep my spine straight when the light burns slightly less for me." He looked at the fallen god steadily. "I don't know how to," he stopped. Found the word. "Receive. I don't know how to receive something that isn't a reduction." He held the Enigma's gaze. "But I know what I saw in that reception hall. And I know what I felt in the between space when you asked permission. And I know that the thing living in me moves toward you the same way my magic does, without my authorization, without calculation, toward something it recognizes as." He stopped again. The word was there. He had been not saying it for weeks, filing it in the category of things without actionable conclusions. But it had an action now. It had been building toward an action since the Solen Hall, since the scent crossing the room, since the temple and the carved object and the word given like a transfer. "Home," he said. "It moves toward you like your home." The between space was far away. They were in the court, in the chamber with the fire and the full even gold and the flowers in the window box holding. They were in the world as it actually was. The Enigma reached out with both hands and held Caliph's face the way he had in the chamber 3 weeks ago. Not pulling him anywhere, just there, present, the paradox warmth of cold hands that were the warmest thing Caliph had felt. "I have been in the between space for 1,000 years, he said. His voice was low in the frequency that registered before language, before the words had to become specific. "In that time I have watched more than I can account for. Courts and the ends of courts. People and the ends of people. The things that were built and the things that were taken and the things that survived the taking." He held Caliph's face carefully. "I have not, in 1,000 years, wanted to be anywhere I was. I have endured it. I have been still inside it. I have watched from it because watching was the only thing that was not taken." He paused. "Until the Solen Hall, until the scent of your magic crossed the room. Dead, gone, absent. And I found it more specific than any magic I had encountered in the previous 900 years. Caliph was very still. "I know what you are," the Enigma said. The words the court had heard in the reception hall, directed differently now. Entirely differently. "I have known since before you knew yourself. And I have been insufficient in the ways that mattered. I did not ask in the temple. I did not return for 7 weeks. I watched when I should have been present." His thumbs moved against Caliph's cheekbones. That small, careful motion, the only thing he permitted himself that was more than permission. "I am not going to be insufficient again." "That's not a confession," Caliph said quietly. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He held his gaze. I love you. That is the confession. I have loved you since before this word existed in any language currently spoken. I will love you when the court is gone and the Fae have become something else and the between space has finally committed to being one thing or another. A pause. I am telling you now because I should have told you before the temple, before the Solen Hall, before whatever specific moment it became true, which I cannot identify because there was no moment. There was simply always, and then there was you, and those two things became the same thing. The fire, the full even gold, the flowers holding. Caliph looked at him for a long moment. At the fallen god with his ancient patience and his directed cold and his careful hands and the 1,000 years of alone that were written into the way he moved through spaces as though he had learned not to expect them to accommodate him. I know, Caliph said. Not I love you too. Not yet, not in those words. He would say those words. He was already in the process of building toward them with the same deliberate accumulation he brought to everything that mattered. But I know was what was true right now, completely and without remainder, and he had promised himself that he would look at things as they actually were. He reached up, covered the Enigma's hands with his own. I know, he said again. I've known since the between space, since the table. I just needed, he paused, time, to build a framework. And now, I have the beginning of one, the corner of the Enigma's mouth, that ghost again. That seed given the right conditions. This time it went all the way, not a performance of warmth, not the social smile that living creatures used to signal non-threat, but the real thing. Slow, fast. The smile of something that had existed long enough to have almost forgotten what this felt like and was remembering. It was, Caliph thought, distantly, unreasonably devastating. The beginning, the Enigma said. I'm thorough, Caliph said. It takes time. I have time. Yes, Caliph said. You do. He closed the remaining distance. The kiss was nothing like the temple, or it was everything like the temple in the ways that mattered, in the quality of recognition, the completion of something that had been in process for longer than either of them could account for. But deliberate this time. Chosen. Both of them present for it. Both of them without the gap of what he couldn't remember, without the fragments and the gray dawn and the waking alone. He felt the Enigma's breath change. One involuntary shift, the body of something ancient making a very human decision to stop managing itself, and felt his own magic respond, full and present and flooding the channels it had just relearned, and the thing living in him responded too, and for one moment all three of them were resonating at the same frequency, Caliph and his magic and the life that the two of them had made in the forgotten temple. The Enigma made a sound, low in the chest frequency, not language. The sound of something finally, after a very long time, arriving somewhere. Caliph pulled back. Not far. Enough to look at him. The fallen god's expression was open in a way Caliph had not seen on anything before. Not vulnerable exactly, there was nothing fragile about it. Open the way ancient spaces are open. The way the between space was open. Entirely itself, without management, without the armor of patience and remove. The framework, Caliph said quietly, is coming along. The Enigma looked at him. I noticed. Caliph's hands were at his collar. Deliberate, unhurried. The precision that characterized everything he did applied here with the full weight of his attention. I'm going to be very thorough about this, he said. I want that established. Established, the Enigma said. I don't do things partially. I know. His hands moved to Caliph's waist, careful, asking in the way that didn't need words, the language they had been building since May I beside the table in the between space. Neither do I. Good, Caliph said. The fire held. The gold held. The flowers in the window box held, and outside the court was quiet, and in the chamber the Fey Prince with his returned magic and his straight spine and his thorough, deliberate framework brought the fallen god down to him with the specific unhurried intention of someone who has decided that this, here, now, is the one thing in the world that is not going to be managed from a distance. What followed was not the temple, not fragments, not warmth without edges, not the gray dawn and the waking alone. It was full and present and entirely on the page, every part of it chosen, every part of it them. The Enigma learned, across that long night, what it meant to be received rather than endured. Caliph learned what it meant to receive something that was not a reduction. The thing living in them both moved and was still and moved again, content in the specific way of something that has always known where it was going and has finally arrived. The child arrived in the between space. This had not been the plan. The plan, Caliph's plan, precise and staged and built across the final months with the thoroughness he brought to everything that mattered, had been to return to the court for the birth, to be present in the Fey world, in documented space, with witnesses and the court physic and the formal record that would establish the child's existence in terms the court could not later revise. He had wanted the paperwork. He had wanted the lineage document signed and witnessed and filed in the archive where it would outlast everyone in the room. The child had not consulted the plan. It had begun in the morning, early, the between space in its ambient pre-light, the quality of air that Caliph had learned to read as dawn even though the between space had no dawn, just a shift in its own internal weather that corresponded loosely to the world outside. He had woken knowing, in the way the body knows things before the mind has processed them, that today was the day, and the day was not going to wait for the court and its paperwork. The Enigma had been awake already. He was always awake when Caliph woke, not waiting, not watching in any way that would have felt like surveillance. Simply present, in the way he had learned to be present without filling the space with himself, available without requiring acknowledgement of his availability. He had looked at Caliph's face and understood immediately. Now, he said. Now, Caliph confirmed. Lyra had been extraordinary. This was the word Caliph would use later, privately, in the accounting he kept of the things that mattered, extraordinary. She had prepared for this with the same competent pragmatism she brought to every logistical challenge he had given her, which was a very long list at this point, and she had prepared for it in the between space with its sourceless light and its odd relationship with time and its shelf of old objects, and she had managed the managing so that Caliph did not have to manage it, which was the rarest and most significant gift she had ever given him. He would tell her this afterward. She would tell him it was her job. He would tell her it was not her job, it was her character, and there was a difference. She would tell him to rest. The labor was long. Caliph had read everything in the archive that was applicable, which was not much. The case study in the old compendium, the one written in the cramped troubled hand, had described the condition but not the resolution, ending with the single line about the old kind and nothing to be done, which was the kind of medical notation that was less helpful in the practical sense. He had extrapolated from Fey birthing accounts, from the physiological texts, from the 3 conversations he had managed to have with the court physic in the weeks after the documentation was established, conducted with the specific neutrality of 2 people pretending that the subject under discussion was entirely ordinary. The extrapolation had been mostly accurate. Mostly. The ways it had not been accurate were the ways that the divine inheritance in what he was carrying made itself known. Not painfully or not only painfully, but with the between-space ambient quality shifting around them as the hours progressed, as though the space itself was responding, was involved, was treating the event as something that concerned it directly. The light changed 3 times. Once when it began. Once in the middle, at the point where Caliph had stopped talking and had gone somewhere inside himself that was not quite language, that was older than language, that his magic and the thing living in him and the between-space and possibly the Enigma's presence all converged on simultaneously. Once at the end. The 3rd change was the most significant. When the child arrived, the between space went fully, completely, perfectly bright. Not blinding, not harsh, the brightness of something that had been waiting to be itself for a long time and was finally being it. Every object on the shelf illuminated. The carved pieces, the folded cloth, the fragment of the old vessel, the piece of dark metal, the small bird shape that was almost a bird. All of them simultaneously with the light of something being recognized. And then the child made its first sound. It was not crying. Caliph had read about infant crying, the physiological purpose of it, the respiratory function, the way it was the first evidence of a working system. He had been prepared for crying. The child made a sound that was not crying, not laughing, a sound that existed in the register the Enigma's voice occupied, the frequency that went to the chest before the ears, but smaller, new, finding its own version of the register. A sound that was entirely itself, that had not decided yet what it would become, that contained in its smallness all of its own futures. The between space, receiving it, went still. Then it exhaled, not literally, the between space did not breathe, but something in its quality changed that was the structural equivalent of a long-held breath released. as though it had been holding this moment in potential for longer than Caliph had been alive, and the moment had now committed to being actual, and the between space could finally stop holding it. Lyra placed the child in Caliph's arms. He looked down. He had been very thorough in his preparation for this moment. He had thought about it from every angle, the variables, the implications, the responsibilities, the logistical and political and personal weight of what it meant to be holding something that was his, that he had built from the inside over long months in the between space with the odd light and the shelf of old objects and the fallen god who was learning how not to be alone. He had not, in any of his thorough preparation, accounted for the specific quality of this. The child was small, smaller than the texts had implied, and the texts had implied small. Dark hair, dense already, which was unusual, and the skin of a fey infant, that translucent quality that would deepen over the first weeks. His eyes were closed. Its face was doing the concentrated work of being a new face, all of its features still in the process of determining what they were going to be. His hands were curled. Caliph looked at those hands, the miniature architecture of them, the fingers folded against the palms, the specific smallness of fingernails that had formed in the between-space odd time while he had been doing archive work at the table, and felt something happen in his chest that was none of the things he had catalogued and all of them simultaneously. The wall, not failing, just permitting, opening deliberately on his own terms for this specific thing. He pressed his lips to the top of the dark hair and said nothing because there was nothing to say that would be adequate, and he had learned, in 3 seasons and then some, that the adequate thing said clearly was always better than the inadequate thing said fully. Instead, he looked up. The Enigma was standing at the edge of the space, that same deliberate positioning, not intrusive, not distant, present in the specific way of something that has learned that closeness is offered and not assumed. He was looking at the child with the expression that was underneath the vast quiet thing and underneath the ghost of the smile and underneath all the rest of it. The oldest expression, the one that had no name in Fey vocabulary or any vocabulary Caliph had access to. He had been alone for 1,000 years. He was not looking at the child like something he had made or something he had claimed or something that belonged to him in any of the ways that power expressed ownership. He was looking at the child the way he had looked at the carved object on the shelf when he placed it between the folded cloth and the old glass, with the recognition of something that had come home to where it belonged. "Come here," Caliph said. The Enigma crossed the space. He sat beside Caliph, closer than the careful measured distance of the early months, the natural proximity of 2 things that have determined their own geometry and no longer need to negotiate it. He looked at the child. "May I?" he said. The same 2 words. The same careful request. The language they had built. Caliph transferred the child into his arms. The Enigma held it with the focused attention of something that understood it was holding something irreplaceable and was making no assumptions about its own adequacy for the task. The child, feeling the cold that was not cold, the paradox warmth, the frequency that it had been hearing from the inside for all the months of its making, made a sound. Small. Its own frequency finding its relationship to the larger one. Its eyes opened. Dark. Very dark. The fey depth of irises that had not yet committed to a color, looking up at the thing holding it with the specific serious attention of something that was encountering the world for the first time and finding it interesting. Not overwhelming. Not frightening. Interesting. The Enigma looked back at it. His expression, Caliph watched it happen and filed it in the place where he kept things that mattered, and filed it carefully, completely, did the thing that the smile had been the ghost of. But larger. Older. The thing that the smile was the small version of. Something that had no name because it predated the language that would have named it, the same as the scent and the frequency and the carved objects on the shelf. He said something. Not in any language Caliph knew. Not in Old Fey, not in the ancient formal registers of the court texts, not in the language of the vet his inscription. In something older, the frequency that went below language entirely, that went to the place where meaning existed before words organized it. 3 syllables, roughly. A name shape, not the child's name or not only something larger than a name. A recognition. A greeting between 2 things that had been aware of each other since before one of them existed in the world. The child's hands uncurled, both of them, simultaneously, reaching upward toward the sound, toward the face, with the unself-conscious absolute trust of something that had not yet learned to question what it moved toward. The between-space light held. Caliph looked at both of them, At the fallen god who had been set down and not ended, holding the small dark-haired thing that was his and also not entirely his, that was old and also entirely new, that was fey and was also something the court would not have a category for, and felt, with the precision that he brought to everything, the specific quality of a calculation that had reached its final result. Not the result he had planned. He had not planned any of this. Not the temple, not the between space, not the long months of building a framework in ambient light with a shelf of old objects and a fallen god learning how not to be alone. He had not planned for this specific morning, this specific brightness, these specific small hands reaching upward. But it was the right result. He was certain of this the way he was certain of very few things. Not because the evidence supported it, though the evidence supported it, but because it was simply true in the way that some things were simply true, in the way that the world looked different when you looked at it as it actually was. They returned to the court 6 weeks later. The child was named in a formal ceremony that the court attended with the specific quality of attention it gave to things it had decided were important and was not quite sure how to categorize. The name was Calith's to give. He had been clear about this, had documented it, had made it part of the formal agreement with Uldren in the reception hall. The Enigma's contribution to the naming was the 3 syllables he had spoken in the between space, the name shape in the older frequency, which became the child's second name, the one that would be spoken in certain contexts and not others, that carried the weight of what it actually was rather than what the court had agreed to call it. The child's first name was Sarin. Calith had found it in the archive, in the oldest texts, in a language that predated the current Fey court by 4 centuries. It meant, approximately, the one who remains when everything else has been set aside. He had chosen it without explaining the choice to anyone. He did not need to explain it. It was simply true. Sarin, at the naming ceremony, regarded the assembled court with the same expression it had given the between space on the morning of its arrival. Serious, interested, not overwhelmed. When Uldren approached, as protocol required, to acknowledge the child's existence in the formal register, Sarin looked at him with the focused attention of something that was categorizing accurately and immediately, and made no sound, and did not reach toward him. Uldren had accepted this. He had been accepting things in the weeks since the reception hall, with the specific quality of someone who had recognized that the variables had changed permanently and was in the process of building new calculations around the permanent change. He would never stop calculating. Calith had not expected him to. He had expected him to calculate with the understanding that certain variables were now fixed. The child, the lineage, the presence of the enigma at the edge of every room, in the slightly lesser light, with the cold that preceded him. It was enough. The chamber was different now. Not the chamber itself, the stone was the same, the window the same, the view of the inner courtyard unchanged. But it had acquired, over the months of what came after, the specific quality of a space that is actually inhabited rather than officially occupied. The evidence of living that could not be staged. A garment on the chair that had not been put there deliberately. A cup on the desk that had been set down in the middle of something and not moved. A small dark carved object on the 3rd shelf 5 back between the folded cloth and a piece of something that had once been glass. A sleeping space that fit 2. A smaller space beside it that fit 1 very small one. Calith was at the desk. Late evening. The court in its quiet register. The formal day concluded. The machinery at rest. He was working through correspondence that was different now from the correspondence of the 3rd step from the bottom. Different in the specific way of work that is being done from a position rather than in spite of the absence of one. He answered letters from border clans and diplomatic envoys and the archive's quarterly request for his consulting expertise on the old texts, which had apparently become known in the weeks after he had publicly corrected the court historian on 3 separate points of pre-court linguistic record. Lyra was in the chair near the fire. She had a book. She had been in the chair near the fire with a book for 6 weeks. Not always the same book, not always the same fire, but always with the quality of someone who has finally, after a long association with logistical challenges, been permitted to simply sit. Calith had told her this was permanent, that she could simply sit indefinitely. She had told him she would believe it when a month had passed without him requiring her to pack a bag on no notice. It had been 6 weeks. She was beginning to believe it. From the smaller space beside the sleeping area came a sound. Small. The frequency that had first been heard in the between space full brightness. Finding 6 weeks later new registers, new variations, the sound of something that was discovering the range of what it could do. Lyra looked up from her book. "I'll go," said a voice. The Enigma from the corner, from his corner, from the shadow between the candlelight and the dark that he had occupied since the first night in the chamber, and that the room had organized itself around with the same gradual accommodation that the between space had organized itself around his 1,000-year presence. He crossed to the smaller space. Caliph turned from the desk and watched. The Enigma lifted Sarin with the focused careful attention that had not changed since the between space, since the morning of the full brightness and the small hands uncurling. 6 weeks in, the carefulness was still there. Not because he was uncertain, but because he understood what he was holding and had no intention of treating that understanding as something that became routine. Sarin, lifted, looked at him. Dark eyes, still not committed to a color, still in the process of deciding what they were going to be. A face that was in the gradual process of becoming specific, of committing to its own features, of accumulating the particular arrangement that would eventually be entirely and only Sarin's. A face that was fey and was also something else, something that certain members of the court looked at with an expression they quickly organized into neutrality, and that certain others looked at with an expression they were less quick to organize. Looking at the Enigma, Sarin's face did none of these things. It did the thing it had done since the between space, since the 3 syllables in the older frequency, since the small hands reaching upward. The thing that had no name in Fey.